What I wanted to do was take the opportunity to be here with all of you to talk about something that, in my view, does not get talked about enough in our industry. All right? So you've had the whole day to talk, sort of Neo, to talk features, to talk use cases, to talk, best practices, in some cases worst practices. But what I want to talk to you about this right now, and what I want all of you to hopefully take away from the presentation today, is to ask that additional question, which is not just what will you build, but why. Now, the logical question, of course, is, well, why would we ask why? What's the question? So we at RedMonk have a term we call the new kingmakers. Anybody raise your hand in the room if you've seen that term before? OK, so there's a handful of you. So the basic idea is that, as Lance said in the introduction, RedMonk is a little bit of a different sort of beast when it comes to analyst firms. So analyst firms, for those of you who don't know, we do research, we talk to people, and we essentially collect a lot of information, and from that we sort of generate conclusions. Now, in the old days, people who did what we do would talk to essentially the primary audience of CIOs. Right? They would run out and talk to CIOs, and they did this because at the time, the only people who had the budget to actually buy technology, hardware, software, whatever, were the people at the top of the organization. So when we got into this business, which was much longer ago than I would care to admit, and I will date myself many times during this talk, it's never a fun experience. But we've been doing this for a while. And when we looked around at the start of our firm, we saw all sorts of technologies being used that had come in through sort of other means, that had been used because they were available, because they did the job, because they were open source in many cases, as we'll get into. So, between open source and between the cloud, all of a sudden, things changed for developers. They put developers in a brand new position. And that turned developers, and when I say developers, I'm really talking about practitioners. So that could be DBAs, it could be sysadmins, it could be data scientists. Basically, it's sort of people like yourselves. And you became, again, what we refer to as the new kingmakers because in the old world, again, CIOs would tell developers what to do. These days, between open source and between cloud and software as a service and a bunch of other things we don't have time to talk about today, you are in a leadership position. You can essentially dictate to, both within your organizations, but within the industry as a whole, direction. You determine what gets used, what doesn't get used. You determine which products succeed and which products fail. So that's why RedMonk, spends, sort of the bulk of our time, sort of trying to understand developer trends, trying to understand developer usage patterns, what's getting used, why is it getting used, what are the directions. So back to what we're here to talk about today. The developers have been empowered to become the kingmakers. That's given you guys effectively this green light. You have had the opportunity to essentially take all these things and build, sort of as you see fit. And this is, again, a stark departure. So in the 90s, I was a systems integrator. And we would go out and talk to clients. Probably some of my former clients are in the room somewhere. And we would go out and talk to these clients. And if we wanted to do literally anything, we had to get budget. If we wanted an operating system, we had to get budget. If we wanted a database, we had to get budget. These days, there's so much available for free or at a sort of low enough cost that you can put it on your personal credit card to try it. You have the green light to build whatever you want. You have the freedoms. And with these freedoms, handed these, developers have, not surprisingly, gone off to the races, right? Handed these freedoms, developers have been creative, have built many, many things. So why is that, right? Why do we like to build things? Well, in many cases, it's just because it's fun, right? So the logical question, I pulled this off Wikipedia. This is a Lego recreation, I believe, of the Queen Mary and its associated infrastructure and gantry towers, the whole bit. So this had to take literally thousands of hours to put together, and God knows how much the Legos cost to put this together. So why would anybody do this? Why would you invest that kind of time, invest that kind of money, invest that kind of effort into making a smaller replica of a ship that itself probably can't sail, probably sinks, probably too heavy? And the answer is because it's fun. And we've all experienced this in some form or fashion, right? So anybody know what this is? Cutting board. Correct, except it's a little more complicated than that. This is what's called an end grain cutting board. This particular cutting board is one that I made for a friend of mine. I make these over holidays. So basically, the notion for an end grain cutting board is basically like a normal cutting board, except you cut it, you rotate the pieces so the fibers are sticking up rather than across. It's easier on your knives, which is essentially completely incidental. Now, you can buy one of these off Etsy for, the last time I checked, for 50 bucks, 65 bucks, go all the way up to 150. You can get the really fancy ones, from companies from, Williams-Sonoma for $200, $300, $400. This one's made out of black walnut. Now, these cutting boards, I make them every year. They come from rough lumber. What rough lumber means is exactly what it sounds like. You get this long board. It's not flat. It's all sort of unevenly surfaced. So you have to put sides on it. You have to plane it. You have to trim that down. You have to cut it up into pieces, cut those pieces up, glue everything together, sand, seal, on and on and on. It's a tremendously tedious process. So again, the same question, like, why the hell would anybody do this, let alone do this for fun? If you can go out and buy something, it'd be a lot cheaper, frankly, for me to buy one of these things as a gift than make it. And the answer is because I enjoy the process. I enjoy the act of creation. I enjoy taking this raw lumber and turning it into something that, at least for my purposes, is a beautiful thing. So, that is the act of creation. That is the sort of act of inception that every developer and every practitioner and every DBA and every data scientist has had in the room, who's sitting in the room right now. Now, obviously, we don't all create physical things. Right? Some of the things we create, in fact, are just an idea or a concept. So this is a quote. It's commonly attributed to Isaac Asimov. As with all other quotes on the internet, its provenance is highly uncertain and dubious. What is certain is that Asimov at least sort of intended this sentiment. And I think this sentiment is exactly correct. Because for all of you in the room who have run queries, right, you understand sort of the idea that by running a query, in many cases, you are creating something new. Right? You're creating something of value, something that was not known before. It's the whole purpose of running the query. If you knew the answer already, you wouldn't run it. So we experience this at RedMonk all the time. And one of the questions that we get all the time is, when somebody hands us a data set and we tell people that we're looking through something, they ask us, what are we looking for? And the answer is always, I have absolutely no idea. I'm going to be looking for something that is unusual. I'm going to be looking for something that says, that's funny. I wonder what that is. So here's an example. So every public company in the world, or in the United States, I thought many of you in the room would find this one particularly interesting. Everybody every public company in the US has to report filings to the SEC. And the filings to the SEC have a whole bunch of different numbers associated with them on the performance of the businesses. Now, I remember distinctly, and I don't remember what year it was, probably 2014, 2015, somewhere in that time frame I first started looking at this. And I noticed that Oracle reported, as part of its filings, the percentage of sale for, of its software revenue that came from a new license versus support and service for the existing products. And I was looking at the charts in these filings, and if any of you have ever looked on the SEC website, let's just say it's not the most user-friendly thing in the world. But even then, even sort of going through raw numbers on the SEC website, there was something about it that just looked weird. I was like, that seems kind of off. So sure enough, went back and pulled the history, for, I think this is up to 2017 now, and, pulled that out and just simply put it on a chart. And this is the easiest thing in the world to do. I mean, literally anybody can use Excel can do this. And this was an active creation that began from that moment where I said, that's funny. And all of a sudden, you can see sort of this, tells a story. It doesn't tell a story necessarily that Oracle loves, and it certainly doesn't tell the entire story of Oracle's business, because Oracle's software revenue certainly keeps going up. But it tells me something interesting that I did not know before. It's that act of creation, that act of insight that we're talking about. Now, many of you in the room have probably seen the story behind the Panama Papers before. And certainly the person who originally leaked these papers had a pretty good idea that something was going on that the public needed to know about. But you have to imagine that the journalists who, in this case, used, there are a lot of people taking this apart, but the journalists using Neo to examine the relationships and the connections and the accounts and the entities in these papers, you have to imagine that at times they were going through this and saying, huh, that looks funny. I wonder what that is. And then follow that train and follow that train and follow that train, and all of a sudden, you have a big story. Literally a story that, depending on who you believe, people would kill for. Now, the logical sort of conclusion from this, of course, for many of the people in the audience, when we go out and talk to folks about things like this, is that, hey, look, not every business is doing this, right? Not every business is working with things that are, arguably life or death. So this is the scene from, for the folks in the room who haven't seen it, from a movie called The Post. It's about the Washington Post in the 1970s and concerns the release of the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were a study conducted by the United States government about the efficacy of the Vietnam War. Now, the story painted a picture that the US government did not like and considered these documents classified, and they were leaked, much in the manner of the Panama Papers. Now, unfortunately, I'm sure for the journalists at the time, there was no NEO, and there were no, certainly other sort of accessible databases, so they had to do all the hard work by hand. But again, this is a relatively unique scenario. This does not come along all the time. And so many of the users, sort of in the audience, are not facing life or death decisions, but they're doing things that are equally valuable for their businesses, right? So, just going off the website, right? I don't know if we have anybody from eBay in the audience. eBay uses, NEO for, routing, essentially routing of packages, finding the most efficient, sort of routes between point A and point B. There's Walmart, that does what they call customer optimization, personalization, to try to make every customer of theirs as happy as this little customer right here. And what does all this have in common, right? Whether I'm talking about Walmart or eBay or the Panama Papers, what they have in common is that they are running queries. They are essentially building applications that are answering questions. But what they also have in common is that it is really fundamentally important for everybody doing this work to ask a basic question, which is why. Now, as I said at the top, I'm going to date myself. Any hands in the room? Has anybody seen the movie Real Genius? It's a 1980s movie of Val Kilmer. Wow, that's actually way more than I thought. All right. So those of you who have seen the movie, you already know the story. So for the rest of you in the room, I'm going to spoil it. Apologies. So anyhow, it involves this sort of, there's a bunch of teen engineers sort of running around. There's these, brilliant kids, and they're trying to solve a problem that involves a laser. And so they get this laser. It's, hits, whatever the power mark is, and, they all go off and sort of graduate. They get to celebrate and so on. And then somebody asks them a basic question, which is, what's that laser for? And one of them answers, I don't know. That's marketing's problem. My focus was on this. My focus was on doing, solving this laser problem. And the other character says, well, what if there's already an intended use for this, and you just don't know about it? And it turns out the laser's purpose was to assassinate people from space. So, net, your heroes, your sort of teen heroes in this sort of 80s comedy, aren't super happy and sort of go off and sort of have misadventures and so on, trying to stop this laser from being used. Still recommend seeing the movie. It's great. But the point is that the lesson here is important for everybody in the room, which is that they should have been asking the question all along, why? What are we building? What are we doing with this? What is the purpose? So why would you do that, right? Because one of the things that we hear from developers frequently when we bring up these questions is, that's above my pay grade. I've been assigned to solve X problem. That's sort of all I need to focus on. Well, it's not. Because again, if you are the new kingmakers, and if you're going to be setting direction for the industry, you need to think bigger. You need to think more broadly. So this is a quote from Voltaire, which basically talks about essentially the responsibility that follows from having great power. Now, many of you probably know this in another form. Yeah, a couple of people in the front know where I'm going. So it turns out Spider-Man is apparently a big reader of Voltaire, and sort of quotes it. I can't remember, it was like 1962 or 3, it was in the comic. But the point stands. The point here is, you really need to think about what you're building, why you're building it, how you're building it, how it might be used. Because the ramifications, can be enormous. So again, dating myself, how many of you have seen the original Jurassic Park? One of the biggest summer blockbusters of all time. So this is a very, very famous quote. You've probably seen it in a million different contexts. But again, I think it reads on what we're talking about here, which is, you're too busy thinking about whether you could. You didn't stop to think if you should. right? And the example there is different than the laser example. You have a whole bunch of people here who think it's a great idea to go out and clone, giant monsters, essentially, that have been extinct for 65 million years for the purposes of building a park. And you wondered, what had happened if somebody along the way, thought, is this a good idea? Should we be doing this? Hey, they have this, this dinosaur called a raptor that is killer and runs 65 miles an hour, hunts like a pack. Maybe it's not the best idea to bring that thing back. So those of you who've seen the movie, know how this ends, and it doesn't end particularly well. A whole bunch of people get eaten by dinosaurs, the whole park burns down, and everybody's sued and loses money. So, okay, that's great, but how does this read in sort of what I do? What are the implications, for what we're talking about? Because, frankly, probably not many of the people in the room, if any of us, are ever going to work on a park that is cloning dinosaurs. Well, it reads on what we do in a variety of different ways, right? These are headlines literally from the past, I think, 4, 5, 6 months. There are more of these arriving every day. And the idea is that the systems that we're building are going to influence dramatically the world around us in ways for good and bad. And that bad doesn't even have to be intended. So if you take the top story here, we're here in New York. New York is a beautiful city. Back in the 1970s, New York had a lot of problems. The Bronx, in particular, had an enormous fire rate, some of which was arson, some of which was sort of accidental. And as a result of this, the mayor was working with the fire chief to try to optimize fire operations. They were also trying to do this, sort of in a time when New York was in a massive fiscal crisis, and the city itself was facing bankruptcy. So they tried to save money in the process. So they called on the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation is essentially a think tank. And the RAND Corporation made specific recommendations for sort of routing and efficiency and fire stations, and ended up closing some fire stations and sort of bulking up some others because the numbers told them that this was the right thing to do. The difficulty with that approach is that, as it turns out, that algorithm, that analysis, was systemically flawed and biased against minorities living in New York City. So the point here is not that anybody's good or bad, but the point here is that what is the outcome? What are we trying to achieve? What are the possible negative implications of this outcome? How do we think about this, right? These are questions that in many cases are not being asked, or not being asked enough, by those of us in the industry and those of us in the room who are the new kingmakers and have been empowered. But again, I'll give you 2 more reasons why you should care about this. And these are completely self-serving and practical. So in other words, if you don't buy into the moral arguments, don't buy into any of the rest of this, why should you care? Here are 2 reasons. So I was overjoyed when I heard that the other speaker this morning was going to be Hillary. I hope everybody in the room had the opportunity to see her speak. As I said many times publicly, I never miss that opportunity if I have it. She's a wonderful speaker and a better technology. She's amazing. And this actually wasn't coordinated. This was planned to be in the deck before I even knew that she was speaking. And her and a colleague, DJ Patil, as was mentioned this morning, I think a couple times, have done a lot of work in terms of looking at artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, technologies, and ethics and bias, right? And these are those are technologies that are increasingly going to be used in concert with things like graph databases. So the point here, essentially, that Hillary's making, and this is part of a whole thread, and like I said, she's written a ton on this, which I recommend that you go find, but the point here, again, is entirely self-serving. If you don't buy into the moral sort of components of the argument, if you don't buy into the idea that you have any responsibility to the wider world in terms of asking the question why, Hillary is giving you a purely self-serving, practical recommendation to do that. And she's, the explanation here essentially is that you need to think about this because the people who are hiring you, the best teams, are going to ask this question. So they are going to ask you specific questions from a system standpoint in terms of, look, this is an issue with building this type of system. It displays this kind of bias. What would you do? And if you don't have the right answers, and sort of worse, if you don't care to think about the right answers, you are going to fail in these interviews, and you're going to deny yourself career opportunities moving forward. Because the reality is that as systems like graph databases and the AI systems that Hillary spoke about this morning become more and more and more common and more entrenched in our daily lives, They're going to influence more and more of our daily lives. They're going to make decisions for us. These decisions have great power, and again, as we've discussed, with that great power comes responsibility. So organizations which are building these systems or assisting, sort of in building these systems, have to consider that responsibility as well. And therefore, when they go to hire, who are they going to hire? People who don't care and don't pay attention, or the people who do? So lastly, I will give you one simple, practical reason to consider this, which is the sort of universal reason, if you will, which is money. So when I talk to organizations, more particularly when I talk to developers, right? One of the things that happens within organizations that employ developers is they do two things which are completely counterintuitive but happen at the same time. They overestimate the capacity of systems, and at the same time they underestimate them. Now, what do I mean? So we've all probably experienced the first part, right? In the sense that we've experienced a scenario in which a business person wants the system to do something that it's just simply not capable of doing. I made the mistake in my own career years ago. Excuse me, a marketer came down to see me. I was sort of working as a consultant in a retail clothing manufacturer. And the person from marketing came down and asked me to generate a quick report. And I said, hey, yeah, no problem. That was the worst thing I possibly could have done. Because from that point on, anything that she needed, she didn't go through the particular channel. She always just came and tried to get me to do it in my spare time. And she could not, I would explain this 10 times a day. She could not grasp the concept of why she could not have every sort of order that the company had ever conducted in a single report. And I just said, look, a lot of these records are on paper. We just physically don't have them. So you have a tendency within organizations to overestimate the capacity of systems. And certainly many of you, I'm sure, have experienced the reality in terms of people expect these systems to be delivered much faster than we're capable of. But there's a flip side. And the flip side is that people underestimate the capacity and the capabilities of these systems because they just don't know what they can do. So, we talked about the Panama Papers as an example, right? And how many journalists sort of in a vacuum would understand the capabilities of a graph database system and how they could be applied to helping to solve that problem and to do that analysis work? Not too many, right? Certainly there are some now, and that's an emerging category. But within sort of the workplace, you are going to have capabilities from a graph database standpoint that are not obvious to the business people that you work with. And therefore, tons and tons of organizational value is as yet unlocked. The people who are going to be successful are not just the developers who can use these tools successfully, but understand how they can be applied to existing business questions. So, think about it just from a simple standpoint. If you are hiring and you have the opportunity to hire 2 developers, both of whom know the technology capably, both of whom are essentially competent, sort of on the system involved, but one of whom has taken sort of the step further. One of whom sort of understands why are we doing this? How might we do this better? How are there opportunities to optimize this? What is the impact from a business standpoint? Maybe you're different than me, but I'm certainly going to hire the person who takes that perspective because they ultimately are going to add more value to my organization. And unsurprisingly, people who add more value to the organization get paid. So like I said, if all the other reasons fall flat, think about making money. So basically, the net here is pretty simple. As you sort of move forward, as you sort of think about the opportunities that you have, sort of in and around the graph database space, think about asking that question. Think about pursuing it to the next level, not just sort of implementing a query, not just sort of writing something quickly because it can be done. Asking context, asking why. And the people, again, who can do all of that and keep all of that in their head at the same time, as with sort of our little mathematical symbology here, are going to be the ones who are ultimately going to have more job opportunities, get paid more over the course of their career, and deliver more value. And depending on the scenario, you may prevent people from getting eaten by dinosaurs. So, if there's one thing that I want all of you to do, when you leave here and you go back to work, you get in tomorrow morning, if there's one thing I want all of you to do, it's that. Keep calm, always ask why. And with that, I'm done. That's me. Unfortunately, I will not be around after the talk. I have to go catch a flight. I'm not hard to find online. That's my Twitter handle, blog. And with that, I will exit. Thank you so much.